Stewart Smyth, who will be presenting today's session and seminar, intriguingly entitled Public Housing in Northern Ireland, the Spectre of Privatisation and Orwellian Newspeak. And Stewart's presentation is picking up on our kind of broad theme of seminars for this year around the future of public housing and social housing in the UK and Northern Ireland. It's great to see so many sort of familiar names and new names as well. If you haven't attended one of these before, we are a small, active, cross-disciplinary research group called the Housing and Communities Research Group, which is part of a larger research centre called CHASM at the University of Birmingham. Dr. Stewart Smyth, my colleague, is also a member of the Housing and Communities Research Group and happens to be the Deputy Director of CHASM too. So I'm really thrilled that Stewart is presenting today. Stewart also has a long-standing interest in social housing in Northern Ireland, particularly around Northern Ireland and the UK, and particularly interested in around sort of funding and accountability. And as an expert as well, he's recently published some reports around the future of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and he's also a member of the Northern Ireland Department for Communities Expert Advisory Panel for the Housing Executive Revitalisation Programme. That will have to be read out. And I'm equally thrilled that another expert in Northern Ireland housing, Professor David Mullins, is also joining us today as a discussant. So looking forward to David sort of leading the discussion, sort of Q&A. In terms of the kind of Zoom logistics and housekeeping, if, as you have done, if you just keep your mics on mute to avoid sort of background sort of noise and disruption, please do feel free to keep your videos on so we can see you if you're comfortable with that. We're going to go straight through from the presentation into the question and answers. And we've got sort of a nice time allocated today, so we're hoping to allow some time for some really good discussion as well. It's a really interesting topic, and Stuart's prepared some, a really fascinating presentation for us. And I think before I hand over to Stewart, David just has a quick announcement, just some really good news for our group as well with regard to two recent sort of doctoral submissions. Thanks, David.
Yeah, morning everybody. Thanks very much for joining the seminar. Just really, we're celebrating a happy time for Housing Communities Research Group. So we're celebrating the latest two doctoral completions. So Peter Shanks has satisfied his examiners on the governance of housing association diversification in Northern Ireland, managing independent social and commercial logics. And so Peter's thesis should be available shortly on the internet for people who are interested in that topic. The other recent completion is Simone Helleran, whose thesis is on what counts, an exploration of engagement with 6 young people escaping homelessness, really depth study of the experiences of what works in homelessness prevention and response. So great news for Housing Communities Research Group, and congratulations to Peter and Simone.
Excellent, thank you, David. Yes, we will echo that congratulations as well. It's fantastic news. So yes, Stuart, I'm going to hand over to you and we'll continue with the proceedings for this afternoon. Thanks, Stuart.
Right, great. Hopefully everybody can see the slides there. There we are. Should be in full screen now. Yeah, I'm delighted to be able to do this presentation, and thanks very much to Halima and David for organising this, and indeed the whole of the seminar series. We've had some earlier this calendar year, including see Paul Watts on the call. We were able to host Paul on his around the time the launch of his book, and we've got more planned for probably early new year as well, around looking at this kind of the future of social housing in particularly England and in Northern Ireland. And that's kind of a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is actually, particularly towards the end of the presentation, is trying to look into the future a little bit in relation to what's happening with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, partly because and those of us who've been following this for just over the last year, is we've had a big announcement last November and about potentially a future for the housing executive, and there's been very little since. So we're still we're in a bit of a darkness, I suppose, about this, and so I'm going to make certain kind of assumptions or try to infer certain things a little bit later on that will allow us to talk a bit more about where we could be going on this. So it kind of the spectre. Sorry, as an overall kind of introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing executive and its history. Not a huge amount there, but I always think that it's important, particularly for people who may be coming new to public housing in Northern Ireland, is about understanding where the housing executive came from, the current challenges, then into some of the literature about what do we know about privatisation of public housing, and then we're going to start to talk about some spectres or sceptres, and in particular we'll talk about this idea of financialised privatisation, and then also the Orwellian newspeak, both of which obviously are in the title, and then finish off with a discussion and conclusion. And whenever I think of spectres, it always comes back, anybody kind of on the left or the radical left will probably be aware of this, that actually one of the more famous uses of spectres in terms of writing is, of course, the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto. That start off with a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Of course, Marx wrote that in German, and then it was initially translated into English as a frightful hobgoblin stalks throughout Europe, and we are haunted by the ghost of communism. And so that always comes to mind whenever, whenever we start to speak about spectres. But I also thought we'd put this up because there you can see a photograph, an image that I was able to pick off the internet of a website who actually sell these mugs, and it's, you know, it's it's an example of what happens under capitalism here, that actually you take whatever views, whatever thoughts and so on, and as long as you can turn it into a commodity and make a profit out of it, irrespective of where the ideas may come from. They have that there, and that's from a website whose strapline is helping independent designers make a profit for their ideas. And I think that kind of idea is actually central to a lot of what we're going to talk about, particularly later on. That there are different ways of the profits being made, and particularly in relation to the ideas around privatisation of public services, and of course that includes public housing. So the origins then of the housing executive, what we've got, it comes out of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement establishes in 1968. Prior to that, there was housing campaigns that were happening in the middle of the 60s, 66 and 67, particularly around Derry. And the reason that housing becomes such an issue in Northern Ireland, we can talk about the kind of where it came from in terms of its 100 years, the centenary and so on. Now this year of the establishment of Northern Ireland, the division of Ireland, but where housing becomes so important is because of what was found in the Cameron report, which was the report done by the British government after the riots that swept across Northern Ireland in particularly the summer of 1969. And they recognised that housing had been used to perpetuate unionist control by allocating housing so as the gerrymandered borders of different wards, etc., actually were maintained. And so you end up in a situation in Derry, for example, where there's a majority Catholic nationalist population, but the council consistently returned majority unionist Protestant politicians. So it comes out of those campaigns in the first place, the roots and the origins of the housing executive, and it was and it still is probably the longest and most significant lasting legacy of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. in Northern Ireland. And to give you some kinds of ideas about actually what happened then afterwards, and it's 50 years since the housing executive legislation was passed in February 1971, and it starts to be established over the following couple of years. In 74, they do their first housing stock condition survey and find that 20% of the homes under the housing executive's management are in poor condition or unfit for occupation. Over the period then of the next 13 years, and this is why one of the reasons why the housing executive is seen as being a success story, by the time we get to the fourth stock condition survey in 1987, that's been reduced to 1 in 12. A couple of other things that are important on here as well. An allocations scheme is brought in, the point system, rather than the discretionary system that we saw from the Cameron report in terms of allocations. That was brought in 74, and largely that's still in place and is seen again as being a success, even though there have been some tinkering around the edges, and there seems to be this constant debate about from politicians on all sides that there is something wrong with the point system, but yeah, no real proposals to make fundamental changes to that. The other thing that's really significant, I think, as well on this slide is the last point, that by the time we get to the mid-1990s, as we've had the kind of the wave of those ideas that are related to privatizations, new public managements, etc., emanating from Westminster, they eventually hit Northern Ireland in relation to housing and public housing in the middle of the 1990s, and the housing executive then is banned from borrowing money because it's considered to be part of the public sector, and that would hit against the public sector borrowing caps. And it's also banned as well from building new homes, and any funds that are available are redirected into housing associations. So again, a very much kind of an idea about trying to reduce the role of the state. One of the things we could make the arguments about here is about saying that between the middle of the 1990s and where we've got to now, kind of 20 years, 25 years later, we've had this restriction of funding that has led to a crisis actually being established in terms of a backlog of funding, a backlog of repairs and maintenance, etc., that is needed. Those of you who are familiar with council housing in Britain will recognise that as well happening, and it's on that basis then that we get to this crisis scenario now where we have to do something in relation to the funding for the housing executive. I see there's some questions, there's some points come up in the chat, but I can't actually see them at this stage. Is there any, do I need to do anything at this stage, David?
Sorry, I was muted. I think there are a number of questions which I think will be addressed. There was one which I didn't kind of quite get about the publications at the beginning. I think was that Anne-Marie was asking about publications. Will they be made available? Anyway, we'll deal with that.
Oh yeah, okay, grand.
Thanks.
Okay, right. So, and this, this success story, PwC, one of the big four accounting firms, not known for being particularly in favor of supporting public services. In fact, actually, there's a long history, along with the other big four accounting firms and management consultants, of being the advocates and in lots of ways providing the kind of the theoretical architecture for various forms of privatization, marketization, commercialization of public services, etc. But even they were brought in to do a report about the future of the funding future of the housing executive in 2011, and very clearly said that the housing executive is one of the success stories for Northern Ireland, and it's rightly regarded nationally and internationally as a leading authority on best practice on both housing management and community building. So we've got this, it's maybe an unusual circumstance. There is no council housing in Northern Ireland. It's all been taken over by the housing executive. It is an expression, and it comes out of reforms that were won by campaigning in relation to the civil rights movement in the late 60s, and actually by and large was left alone to go and do about its business in the 70s and the 80s, and became a success story. Before then, restrictions in funding that have led to the situation now where, you know, by and large, I think generally the political parties in Northern Ireland were quite happy that the housing executive was doing what it was doing, because it meant that they didn't have to go anywhere near housing, particularly as a political priority. And as I was kind of outlining on the previous slide, that's also meant that, particularly when we've had the Assembly being and devolution and the Stormont government being set up, housing really, public housing really hasn't been a political priority at all. Any funds that have been available have been directed elsewhere, into co-ownership schemes, into housing associations to build new social housing. As I mentioned, the housing executive hasn't built any new homes since just after the turn of the century. But it also meant as well that there was a growing backlog of maintenance and repairs that needed to be addressed. And previous DUP minister in 2013 made the announcement that the housing executive was going to be taken out of the public sector in some form of stock transfer. One of the things that's kind of an interesting parallel on this is, if you look at the history of stock transfers, which is basically taking the council housing in Britain, particularly in England, and handing it over to a housing association to get round these government borrowing rules that we'll talk about in a minute. That kind of developed organically. It wasn't a deliberate policy, but through a series of kinds of legislative moves and initiatives, you have then stock transfer starts to emerge in the late 80s and the early 90s. So you had something similar happening at the end of the noughties in Northern Ireland, where you had two initial stock transfers, one in Bangor and one in Derry. That happened kind of organically. It wasn't it wasn't an overarching policy. We get to 2013, and we have the overarching policy being brought in, and a kind of a series of pilot schemes, a small scale stock transfer that was going to be set up. The housing executive has 85 at that time. It had close to 90,000 homes, and so 2,000 homes were put on the stock transfer, these small scale stock transfers. And what we end up with is in I think it's 16 and 17, the first two estates have their ballots amongst the tenants about whether they want to go to change their landlord from the housing executive to the particular housing associations, and both of them were rejected. Both of them decided to stay overwhelmingly with the housing executive. And then at that stage, that small scale stock transfer stops, the Assembly collapses and so on. And in the middle of the Assembly not being up and running in Northern Ireland, we have the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Communities, which is the department relevant for the housing executive, comes out with this letter and says that by last year, if there isn't a funding settlement for the housing executive set up, then they would have to start to de-invest in approximately half of its portfolio. Now, that kind of, I think that letter did start to focus minds more on saying we have to do something in relation to public housing and funding the housing executive to address the backlog of repairs and maintenance, etc. And never mind actually any idea about building new housing executive homes. The other thing that's important to note just before I start on the reclassification arguments, it's important to note on this in the political sense, is that the minister in charge of the housing executive, so various ministers for communities and so on, up until the Assembly was re-established in 2020, had never been a Sinn Féin minister, mainly DUP. And of course, what this meant was that actually the DUP are pro-privatisation, anti-public services in a general sense, there will obviously be individuals who have slightly different views, but as a party, that's the general position. So there was never any expectation that we had that you were going to get anything from the DUP other than some form of taking the housing executive out of the public sector and trying to give it over to private sector to run in various different ways. There was, when we got a Sinn Féin minister, there was an expectation that there might be something more here and that we would actually get some prioritisation of public housing. And Caroline Coulon, who was the minister at the time, she was standing in because Deirdre Hargey was on sick leave for part of 2020, basically made this big announcement in November of last year, the essence of which, there was many parts to it that included other aspects of public of the housing system, but the main focus on it was about saying, we're coming up with an idea, or here's the idea that we've got for a new settlement for the housing executive. And she said a plan to change the classification of the housing executive landlord to a mutual or cooperative designation so that it may borrow. Okay, and what's driving this? What's behind this? And it's the same thing that was behind and driving the stock transfers in Britain, is that the government rules for what is considered to be on books and off books in relation to borrowing, decide that, or specify that, mutuals and cooperatives are in the private sector, whereas the housing executive and council housing is in the public sector. When you dig into that a little bit further, the people who make these decisions, who make these interpretations, right, are the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. And the ONS say that they look at a range of issues, right, but the overall idea when they're deciding about is a body in the public sector or the private sector, but is this concept of control. Who actually controls the organization? And by the way, when for ONS purposes and for government borrowing purposes, the private sector, they don't make the distinction between not-for-profit and for-profit organizations. They're all in the private sector. They're subcategories in the private sector for government borrowing and ONS purposes here. When you dig further into this, and they're using the kind of the Eurostat rules still on this, the overall principle that they apply is they say it's the person who has a last say as regard to important decisions. Okay, so and you can see how that would work in terms of the housing executive. You know, there is direct accountability to the minister from the housing executive, and we can illustrate this a bit more in a minute if we look at what happened to housing associations. Because even though you could say, and you might think, well, these are hard and fast rules and there should be a clear dividing line, actually the reality is that the boundaries between the public and the private sector, even with that simple distinction between public and private, are fluid and changing. And the way that we can see that is in relation to what I've called the housing association hokey cokey here. Similar things happened in England, Scotland, and Wales. These I'm using the kind of the information here in relation to Northern Ireland. So in England, this happened in 2015. Northern Ireland happens 2016. The ONS goes back and actually looks back at some legislation that was 10, 15 years old and said, hang on, the minister has control here. These are highly regulated. And actually, if you apply the principle that the minister has a last say, then these should be housing associations in Northern Ireland should be on the books. So originally, they were considered off the books. They were in the private sector up to 2016. The ONS does a review, establishes that the minister has a last say on areas around things like consent for disposal of land, potentially forcing housing associations to dispose of certain assets, putting members' appointments onto particular committees in housing associations. So very significant control powers, and as well about petitioning for a winding up as well. So the ONS say the minister has a last say here. So in 2016, housing associations were reclassified and brought back into the brought into the public sector, considered to be on the books. Then we have the Housing Amendment Act in 2020, which effectively goes through that list that I just went through about control elements in relation to consent, in relation to disposals, in relation to appointments on boards, winding up, and so on, and removes all of those from the minister and from the department. And so in effect what we get is then the housing associations are reclassified as private bodies, and they're off the books again. But in the process, of course, what's happened is there's been a big reduction in the control and the last say that the minister can have in relation to housing associations. This is relevant because this is the process that the housing executive is going to go through, right? And if you look at, I spotted this the other day. I didn't put it up as a slide, but on the housing executive website, they've got a diagram an organizational diagram that shows the accountabilities, including the housing executive board at the top there, and then a direct line to the minister as the accountability. That line has to be broken for the ONS, in the ONS's views, for the housing executive to be then reclassified, which in essence means, in ONS terms, put into the private sector to allow it to borrow again. So some of us made a little bit of a stir about this and pointed these things out this time last year, run up to Christmas and early in the new year. And then Deirdre Hargey comes back off sick leave and actually kind of makes a more nuanced approach to the previous approach in relation to the housing executive future, and says that if there's a way that the housing executive can borrow without change, that's her primary option. All right, we're assessing all the options. That's clear. That's consistently all the written responses from ministers to questions. They've all come back and have all said we're looking at all the options at the moment. We want to co-design with tenants, etc., and employees, but we're looking at all the options. It's a little lack of clarity there, or quite a lot of lack of detail. Then she goes on to say, I would like to do this while retaining the housing executive's current classification. Okay, so that's quite a different thing to we're going to turn it into a mutual and a cooperative. But, and this is where I'm I have to infer certain things. And from what we can tell from what's in the public sector at the moment, the preferences for the minister are the housing executive must be able to borrow again. Everybody agrees with that. I don't think anybody disagrees with that at any stage. Such borrowing must occur without taking existing capacity from other departments, particularly health. That's a constant theme in the responses from ministers and indeed other Sinn Féin spokespeople as well on this, that actually, in all good conscience, I can't go and say we need to take public funding away from hospitals to build new houses. So that's clearly not a political choice for them. Any changes must be kept to a minimum and emphasize continuity. This again, go back to November 2020, Minister Nicolon in the Q&A after her statement, was clearly saying tenants won't even notice that there's been a change, right, on this. So they want to keep it to a minimum. And as you can see from Minister Hargey's last sentence there, the preference is to retain the housing executive's current classification, which is as a quasi-public corporation. Now, you look at those four preferences, it seems to me that if you want to do 1 and 2, unless you are willing to challenge Westminster government over their borrowing rules, and there has been campaigns over this over the years as well. As far as I understand, it's still I think it's still the Chartered Institute of Housing's position that the classification for council housing and public housing is out of line with international best practice on this. But if you're not willing to challenge those rules of Westminster, if you accept 1 and 2, you can't do 3 and 4. If you accept that it must be allowed to borrow again, and you're not going to take money from anywhere else, you're going to then have to take the housing executive out of the public sector, change its classification, and there will be significant and major changes even if it's put into a not-for-profit that we'll talk about. So these preferences, there's a huge problem here, and I'm just pointing out, on one level, I'm just pointing out this is the issue, the nub of the contradiction that the minister faced, and I think it's probably one of the reasons why, or it's not the major reason why, we haven't had any detail in a year since the announcement, because they've realised that this is where the issues are at. I don't know how they square that circle in particular. They've got, well, other than it's political choices, you have to make some political choices about this. So what do we know about privatisation? I think we all agree, and going back over and reading David and Hal Parsons' book, After Council Housing Again, right to buy, yeah, is a form of privatisation, no question about it. Transfers, certainly writing in 2010 at that point, some people would have always said that stock transfers are a form of privatisation. That's been the position of campaign groups like Defend Council Housing, that even using mutuals or cooperatives, that DCH then call them privatisation in a fancy wrapper. Some other academics, particularly more public management style ones, were saying, no, these are not forms of privatisations, they're not outright privatisations the way we understand. I think David and Hal Pawson put together this kind of table and, you know, to say this is where the evidence is. Right, there are aspects of this that fit with the criteria of what we would understand for privatisation, particularly demunicipalisation, and the transfer of risk in relation to borrowing side of things. But there are others where it's not so clear around deregulation. I think, and this is where I got to in terms of the arguments now. And what's going to lead into where we're going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. Things have changed in the 10 years, 11 years. And just thinking about the deregulation side of things, actually, you know, what's happened with the housing associations and the way that they were reclassified. There's been deregulation with housing associations now. So they're not as regulated as they were previously. And so that then gets us to the idea that what we're looking at here is a process. It's not a single event, right? And in that respect, I think Norman Ginsberg's work actually fits very well with this idea that actually transfers mark, and that when we talk about transfers here, we mean reclassification as well, mark a decisive shift towards private landlordism with public control and accountability fading away over time. It's this idea that there is a process that is going on here that is not just about the single event. Okay, and so that then gets us to this first spectre, the spectre of financialized privatization. It's something actually in the reading preparing for today that I just come across this particular formulation. So as I was saying, a lot has changed since 2010, I think, in relation to social housing providers and housing associations. We've had the growth of the corporate bond market and funding, use of group structures, joint ventures in relation to, and local limited liability partnership projects, stock exchange listings for companies who are parts of groups that sit as housing associations, full market operations, for-profit housing associations. The landscape is very different, I think, than it was 10 years ago. In short, social housing providers are much more commercialized now, much more financialized. And it's in that respect, this quote from Manuel Albers, I think, actually starts to ring true with me in relation to what's being proposed for the housing executive. So with financialized privatization of semi-public institutions, these private organizations with public goals become entangled in a web of debt and derivatives. That's the potential future that we're looking at in relation to the housing executive. All right. Now, there's a number of ways we could talk about this, and maybe we'll talk about some of the other kinds of examples of this in the debate. The way that I thought I'd illustrate this is by looking at kind of the ghost of Christmas to come, seeing as how we're talking about hobgoblins and spectres, and it's nearly that time of year again. All right, this is from a piece of work that we did a couple of years ago on the G15 and housing associations based in London. And these, I thought this is best in terms of the parallels, because if you're thinking about at the time this was done, so this was 2016, these were the biggest London-based housing associations. None of them, L&Q is the only one that gets anywhere near the size that the Housing Executive is. Right? So this is kind of what we're looking at in terms of a like-for-like comparator. I know others have talked about other kind of transfers like Rochdale, right, which is only 12,000, even Biker Community Trust, which is just one estate. This is kind of much more what we're looking at in terms of the Housing Executive. All right, and you can see nearly all of them have issued corporate bonds of various different sizes here. All right, and it means as well that they have to then have credit ratings, and they then have to consider what the credit rating does in terms of their operations and their strategies, right? And so you get this quote from Affinity Sutton, that was one of the G15, right? That actually, I think, really captures the way that the culture changes and the ideas around the credit rating. And of course, credit ratings are there to protect the debt providers, because that's what a credit rating is. It's about the likelihood of default on the debt. So it's there to protect the debt providers, right? And Affinity Sutton saying that they've got a reputation of robust financial management, right? Recognized in sector leading credit rating from Moody's, right? And here I think is the kicker. We see maintaining this strong financial position as one of our core objectives, because without it, we would not be able to achieve our broader aims. Now, if you compare that, you can see clearly here what's happening in relation to the credit ratings, the way that it's becoming a strategic priority for a social housing provider. The Housing Executive currently doesn't have any of that. Doesn't have a credit rating, doesn't have corporate bonds, no concern about maintaining a relationship with a rating agency or having to do roadshows to raise funds, etc. So this is where that kind of financialized privatization, I think, starts to come in. A couple of other ones, the operating margin for the G15 over that 10-year period increased up to 30%. Why is that significant? That's the marker that the credit rating agencies use in terms of giving the highest possible rating is 30%. And here, just on this one, I wanted to illustrate, here's an example I was saying about the corporate group structures. East Thames, right smack bang in the middle there. East Thames, which is a housing association, this is not for profit, etc., but is now a group, right? And right in the middle there, they have a public limited company listed on the London Stock Exchange because they issued a bond and they wanted that bond of 250 million to be tradable. And so you start to see in these group structures the way that they are starting to change, as well as these other kind of development vehicles, treasury vehicles, all limited liability companies. Okay, so just moving on then, the spectre of Orwellian newspeak. My fear is that the minister and officials can't find a way through or around the borrowing requirements. And so what they'll end up doing is that they'll fall into line with the Westminster priorities, they'll reclassify the Housing Executive, but in the process, they will not recognize or refuse to engage with the ideas that we've talked about here, the impacts we've talked about here in relation to privatization and in relation to opening up the Housing Executive to these processes of financialization. Right, so we end up in this Orwellian newspeak world. Those, 1984 have read the book, etc. There are terms that Orwell uses there. The one that I picked out here, we could have talked about kind of double think and double speak as well, but I thought the one that's probably more relevant here is this black-white term that Orwell uses, where it's applied to opponent to undermine an opponent by claiming that the opponent is saying black is white when the facts are the other way around, right? Or significantly, this is applied to party members, where it means a loyal willingness to say that black is white is necessary when party discipline demands this. This is in part has come up from my experience of engaging with engaging on social media, but also as well actually observing and debating in some council meetings where we've talked about the housing executive and the prospect of reclassification, what it means. And members of the same party of the minister just plainly said it's not privatisation, not giving any reason or anything like that. It's not privatisation, and also as well the claim that of course if you reclassified a housing executive, there will be no public housing left in Northern Ireland, and just pointing out that in terms of jurisdictions in these islands, it would be the only one that didn't have any public housing. That was considered to be an outrageous claim, right? So there's this kind. I think we end up in this kind of scenario where we just counterclaims being made against each other, and actually not any kind of clarity in terms of any debate or any realization about the impacts that are happening. So just two more slides. I focused on the financial aspects here of reclassification for two reasons. One is because it's the borrowing rules and the ONS rules that are driving this, but also as well because I think reclassification unleashes these financialization processes and logics that are that the housing executive and that housing stock will be subject to if reclassification goes ahead. There are many other issues we could have talked about: governance, accountability, control, tenant participation, etc. Those NIPSA reports, and I can put some of the links in the chat during the discussion on this, actually to those reports. They're publicly available on the web. And I think this idea about financialized privatization captures the essence of what's being proposed here. It's not traditional privatization, because it's not like the 1980s where the Thatcher government is privatizing the utilities and setting up shareholders and encouraging everybody to be part of a shareholding democracy and all that kind of stuff, and the shareholders then get dividends out of it. That's not privatization in the 21st century, or certainly in the second and third decades of the 21st century. Now it's a financialized privatization. It's about extracting profits, but doing it through debt, through the financial logics, through loading debt onto organizations and then taking the returns in terms of interest, etc. Right. So how does the newspeak future, how is that possible? I think partly it's because reclassification and transfers, they're complex in nature, and understanding the nature of them. I don't think the literature has been particularly helpful on this, because we've ended up with a series of different positions on it. And also as well, I think the newspeak future is possible because there's an old view of what privatizations are like now. I've tried to argue against that in relation to this idea about financialized privatization. The key to understanding what's happening at the moment, I think, is the role of private capital, finance and financial logics. It does matter where the money comes from. It does matter if the debt is coming from a corporate bond that requires a credit rating, as opposed to the public works loan boards. It does make a significant difference. And there's hard choices. Like I said, I tried to say earlier, there are hard choices that need to be made here. There is a contradiction right at the heart of what's being proposed, and the outcome ultimately is going to be decided in a political realm in terms of political will. And I think this is where campaigning and social movements, and indeed the work that NIPSA has done in relation to the small-scale stock transfers previously, can have a significant role and impact. Thanks very much for your time. I hope I didn't speak too long.
Thanks very much, Stuart. That's excellent. And